Well, I've been reading Porkopolis, American Animality, Standardized Life, and the Factory Farm. And by the way, I don't know if you can see that, but I could make a half bad president, right? This book is by Alex Blanchette. And when I did a little bit of research, um, what I found is something kind of curious and funny, and maybe it will help to, stomach kind of what remains to discuss about this book, which is really, it's got some really good points. But there's two Porkopolises at least. There's Porkopolis the book with the subtitle that I just gave, and then there's Porkopolis the restaurant, which looks to be in Cincinnati. And I'm wondering how that's going down. It's interesting. It's not a bad name for a restaurant. If you hadn't have heard of the book, and I'm sure the restaurant was around before the book. So anyway, you might, I don't know, go to Porkopolis when it opens up again. It'd be interesting. And then there's two Alex Blanchettes. The author of this book is Alex Blanchette. Which one of these is he? Well, they're both really like cool dudes, obviously. But it turns out to be this guy who looks a little bit more like a professor because he is a professor. He's from Tufts University. He's an associate professor. He got his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. And he's the author of two books. This was actually his dissertation, Porkopolis, which he's revised and got published by Duke University Press. And he's the author of a book from 2019, How Nature Works, Rethinking Labor on a Troubled Planet. So you can kind of tell, even by the titles of his books, what he's interested in and what he's concerned about. And his interests and concerns definitely I can relate to, because he's really into the effects of a certain type of production on labor, on the people who do the labor. I picked this up from his personal, or his website at Tufts. This is his own self-description, and if you watch the channel for a while, that I like to go and see like what they've actually said about themselves rather than coming up with something on my own. I think it's a charitable thing to do. So here he says, my research is concerned with the politics of industrial labor and life in a post-industrial United States. My first book, Porkopolis, American Animality, Standardized Life, and the Factory Farm, is an ethnography of labor within some of the world's largest meat corporations, one that follows the making of the pig across every facet of its existence, from genetics to some 1,100 post-death commodities. It examines the transformations to human being in terms of living arrangements, the value of work, biological embodiment, and senses of identity and personhood, necessary to sustain contemporary qualities and quantities of industrial animal life in the rural United States. I am currently researching a second book project on traces of large-scale slaughter in contemporary Chicago, one that begins with the closing of the Union Stockyards, aka the Jungle, and that was Upton Sinclair's book, in 1971. It asks how people try to maintain, remake, overcome, or redeem the legacies and ecological remains of the meat packing yards that gave us facets of industrialism as we know it today. At Tufts University, I teach a range of classes on environmentalism, the end of work, animal life, food production, labor justice, reinventing political economy, and ethnography, which would be a methods class. So notice here that he's producing what's called an ethnography of labor. This is what this book is, an ethnography of labor. And from what I have heard from my anthropology friends, ethnography is something like what political scientists would call soak and poke research. Political scientists kind of gave up on that in favor of crunching numbers, but apparently anthropologists are still going out there and willing to kind of embed themselves into situations, kind of almost like a journalist, a good journalist, that is, in order to really learn how things are done, how people think, how they live. And you may remember I did a series on Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land. She did this as a sociologist. She went down to Louisiana, and she lived for quite a while in and around the people that she interviewed, having to do with environmental degradation and jobs and so on in these chemical and petroleum manufacturing areas of Louisiana. Blanchette has done something similar here, where he actually was employed by these large concentrated animal feeding operations and did various facets of the work and observed a great deal, and did so on the record, so to speak, as in it seems to me that that they knew what he was doing and why he was there, but he was still allowed to do it. And this ethnography follows the norm in this genre of research of not naming names for real and not identifying companies for real. So the names of the companies and the names of the individuals are most likely substitutes for the real ones, because he probably wouldn't have been able to gain access and honesty if he didn't do that. So as I understand it, that is the norm in this field. So when we get into this area of concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, and pork processing facilities, there's a narrative that's kind of emerged in the past 20 years or so, in particular, that's very critical on the basis of animal rights or animal welfare, and sometimes critical on the basis of worker welfare as well. But there seems to be more emphasis on animal welfare than worker welfare. And I think that at the very least, Blanchette reverses the focus. But more than that, Blanchette is not mainly trying to create an argument that, just gives you the plight of either the animals or the workers as an appeal to, sort of empathize with them. But rather, he's doing something that a lot of other authors don't do. We have many authors that aren't, it's a genre all of its own that we don't need to talk about anymore because it's been done so well. He's deviating from this focus on appealing to animal welfare or simply sort of the moral or immoral nature of treating animals and workers in this way. He wants to more or less describe what's going on and to put it in this larger context of, the demands of the capitalist consumer economy, of, what it takes to produce cheap meat, of the effects on both animal and humans and their interactions with each other and their relationships, which are so intertwined that they can't be disentangled, the effects of all that upon life itself, the living of life, in the workers and the animals in the towns. For many of us, we didn't think very much about large animal processing facilities of late until coronavirus hit pork processing factories like Smithfield and, literally threatened the pork supply for consumers, and probably still does. I don't know. I think it's way better, but there have been times in this coronavirus pandemic where, because these plants would get hit with so much coronavirus in the workers, that they had to shut down. And it showed a weakness among the many weaknesses that we've seen in our food supply system. during this time, a weakness regarding the way labor is done in these factories that makes it difficult to control the spread of viruses. And it makes it difficult to get product to the consumer when this is going on, because so much of the processing has concentrated, talk about concentration, into a few companies and a few places. And when you do that, you create both great efficiencies, but when things go wrong, great bottlenecks. Anyway, so this is maybe what's on your mind, and it's not that it's not on Blanchette's mind. In fact, in the interview that the Duke University Press people did with him, they brought that up as an issue of contemporary significance and a reason for reading his book, and it is. But his main focus is not on that. In fact, the book would have been written before there was much of a glimmer of that particular problem. But what he does is he talks about the way this is all set up. And he makes and I'm just going to talk about a few general points because I'm going to go into greater detail on specific things in the next few videos. And we'll probably have a conversation or two amongst myself and other folks who've read this book. But, he talks about things like food production being where the scientific factory theory like Taylorism and Fordism and its practice are resurgent. In these towns, it's almost like, although they're super like advanced in some ways, they are also kind of throwbacks to this earlier age of factory production. This is where factory production still definitely thrives in this scientific, very ordered, managed, and continually more efficient way. And also, of course, going along with that, the company town that you hear about from the 1930s on to like maybe the 60s, it still exists very much so. Like these companies and their operations create towns or attract people to towns. And the entire economy and the social life, which is the interesting part about the book, even the social life, one of the interesting parts. The social life revolves around the plant. Like the rules of engagement amongst people have something to do with, their work at all times. So in pork production, he argues the priorities of a streamlined, standardized animal shape the human practices and try to create a sort of streamlined, standardized human. And this spills over even into what we would call the private life. So the private life kind of is erased in a lot of cases for workers in these big operations and factories. Human hierarchy within the companies divides over proximity to pigs, and the hierarchy includes racial hierarchy and, of course, income hierarchy and gender hierarchy, and the usual things show up. And he points out that there's this astounding turnover rate. Like at one point, I think he says there's almost 100% turnover rate year to year in some of the more manual parts of the work involved in processing thousands and thousands and thousands of pigs every day, of gestating them, feeding them, slaughtering them, and processing them. People don't stay in this line of work all that long, or they go into it and then they go out of it and then they come back. But yet, because of the standardization, and this is probably one of the reasons why there's such a strong emphasis on it, these operations in good times thrive. So, for me, stepping back and thinking about what I've learned about the book so far, and I'm about halfway through, I would say it's making me contemplate again this Faustian bargain that we've made with cheap food. I understand totally that we now have an economy because so many people are paid so badly because everything runs on money and making sure that everything is extremely efficient and that profits are made. Food has to be cheap. And people have to have access to cheap food or they will starve. So it's not a problem that's easily solved, and I'm not being critical of the most of us who buy it, including myself. We're all beneficiaries of this cheap food that isn't particularly healthy, but at least it allows us to not spend our entire wages on food. But it is a Faustian bargain, because we're at this point because it goes along with the overall economy, which requires most people to be fed extremely cheaply because they're just not getting very much. And of course, these workers at these plants and CAFOs are perfect examples of how cheaply people are kept. Sort of tangential, but maybe not. I went through an Arby's today for my parents who needed an Arby sandwich. And the young man behind the counter was rightly agitated as all get out. We went through the drive-through, and he was getting orders barked in one side of his head, and he was having to try to deal with me on the other, and he actually had enough brain power left over to realize that my voice was different than the voice he'd heard like 4 people ago. And he was like, wait a minute, am I out of order? You're not the person who ordered the sandwich. And I'm like, oh no, it's my dad ordered it. He's in the back seat. And he was kind of a little bit flustered, but mainly he was just really irritated. And I don't blame him. He's getting paid whatever it is. He's probably getting paid like whatever the minimum wage is here, $8.50 an hour, to deal with the amount of stress and communication chaos of somebody like most of the people I know who make middle class salaries would never be able to deal with the level of stress and feelings that he has to deal with. So, that reminded me again how much of the demand we put on people, that guy is a part of delivering us our cheap food. The pigs eat cheap food, and we eat cheap food because the pigs eat cheap food and get like taken care of from birth to death by people who are paid cheap wages. Does it have to be this way? I think that's what this book is doing for me the most, is helping me contemplate that question anew, and maybe pointing in the direction of, if we can figure out why this has happened and how it's happening, figuring out what could be possibly done about it. At least that's what I'm hoping for. So I look forward to getting into the book more next week, but that's by way of introduction. And again,